Hey, everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's me, Diana Perry Cruz. Hi.
And it's me, Jackie.
Oh, boy. Well, we are very excited because we're recording this. This is coming out, I think, I don't remember a month's time. It's coming out. It's very soon in the winter where we are. It's coming out in March? Okay, March. So it's hopefully warming up. And hopefully people have been thinking about the goals they set for themselves to the start of 2025. It's definitely 2025. I know that much about our recording schedule.
It is, yeah.
And even though we're a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, wherever we could pick a topic and discuss relevant research articles, we still have goals just like anybody else. And sometimes we have to ask ourselves, are these goals meaningful? Are they useful? Are they good? Should anyone bother? Should we even waste our time on these goals? And so now that we are in the almost the end of the winter in New England, it's time to look back and say, were those goals worthwhile? Were they pointless? Were they meaningful? And, is there anything wrong with us picking goals for ourselves? What if we picked goals for other people that were similarly as bad as the goals we picked for ourselves? Would that be an ethical quandary? And while we were thinking of all of this and feeling bad because, our goals weren't that great to begin with, I guess, so we're striking out on all fronts, we decided let's call in a pro to talk about this. Fortunately, who had also published on the subject, so we could make a podcast out of it as well. How nice, how great. And that is why we are joined today with Dr. Shanna Bahry to talk about the ethics of meaningful goals.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yes.
We're very excited to have you.
Yeah.
I remember I was so excited at the Babbitt Social last year. Remember? Do you remember that?
She really was. She was like, I can't wait until you're on. I'm so excited.
I love that. I love being excited about this topic. It's so great that people are starting to talk about it, and I'm hoping it's going to gain some traction because I'm biased, but I think it's the most important thing for most of us.
I was very excited about that. One of these articles had just been published, I think, maybe, or I had just found it at that point in time. So I was extremely excited. And then Jackie was like, wow, you fangirled really hard. And that's why I handle the guest.
It was like met by the food too. And I think you literally just wanted to get like an appetizer.
No, you were working the raffle desk.
I
remember
that.
The raffle decks and by the appetizers, like right at the end.
Maybe.
And I was like, this is why. Because we would never get anything done.
Oh.
No, you guys are great.
I'm really glad you're doing the work that you're doing. And I'm really happy you're going to be on the show so everybody can hear about it.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. That's awesome.
So, Shanna, could you just, for our listeners, sort of tell folks a little bit more about yourself and how you became interested in the topic of goals, goal writing, what goals are out there, exploring the world of goals or potentially their utility or their lack of utility in many cases, it seems.
Yeah, for sure. And the lack of utility is probably what got me interested in it. So I've been in the field a while, probably, 10 to 15 years. But I've worked in a variety of settings, like most behavior analysts probably worked in home-based settings. I've worked in ABA clinics, and I've spent a lot of time in specialized ABA schools, kind of severe challenging behavior. But early on in my career, I was fortunate enough to one of the places I worked was kind of connected to an adult services day program. So we had to walk through that section to get to HR and stuff. So we were able to see this is kind of where some individuals who are adults kind of end up after the children's services. So I think that is, something I feel really fortunate to have experienced early on, because I think that could be one thing that we could do in general to help people have kind of the end in mind of this is where we're headed. So how can we prepare for that? So kind of knowing what the track is kind of for a lot of individuals on the spectrum and with other disabilities really got me into thinking okay, why are we doing this? What's the point of this? And so I think that's really where I fell into wondering what we're doing for adult services. I met Peter. Well, first I was just in his audience for a while, just being a fan of his and hearing what he talked about. I'm like, this is such, seems like common sense, which isn't always common also. But so I got really passionate about it. We got to work together at Endicott, and I got my PhD under his guidance. So we got to work a lot together and eventually develop the book. And which I'm sure we'll talk about different things within that. So yeah, that's kind of how I stumbled into it and got kind of passionate about it, and, you know, here and there angry about like, why are we doing this? What's the point of this? And also just kind of also knowing that everyone I worked with, even though in my mind, it's like, why are we doing this? This is silly. It's like everyone in the field is well-intentioned. So I think that is also like, how can we better expose people to this who didn't get exposure to the adult world at all? And how can we, you know, get this information out there, get people on the same page, and like really understanding like, why are we doing, or just to start thinking about why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we teaching what we're teaching? So kind of that's in a nutshell.
Sure. Well, we have 3 Bahry original articles that we'll be discussing on today's show. Diana, can you help us out? What will we be talking about?
Okay, we have 3 articles provided to us by Dr. Bahry today to discuss, and they include Improving Outcomes for Adults with ASD by Targeting Meaningful Skill Acquisition Goals, a review of the literature and available assessments and curricula by Bahry, Gerhardt, Weiss, Driscoll, Leaf, Ayres, and Cauchi, and that was published in the Review Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, 2024. Also, The Ethics of Actually Helping People, Targeting Skill Acquisition Goals that Promote Meaningful Outcomes for Individuals with Autism Spectrum Disorder by Bahry, Gerhardt, Weiss, Leaf, Putnam, and Bondy, and that was published in Behavior Analysis and Practice, 2023. Also, Improving Goals Written for Individuals with Autism, Preliminary Results on Assessing Meaningfulness and Relevance in Adulthood by Bahry, Gerhardt, Weiss, Leaf, and Ayres, and that was published in Behavioral Interventions, 2024.
Woohoo! Some familiar names across those articles.
Yes.
Some patterns. So Shanna, we actually had Dr. Peter Gerhardt on as one of our earlier guests, probably getting close to about 10 years ago on the show now, talking about preparing, you know, educational plans for adolescents. And Jackie's making a face like she doesn't remember this. You know why you don't remember it? Because you didn't interview Peter Gerhardt. It was me. I did it by myself.
I remember him being on the show. I was just making that face because 10 years.
Okay, it was old. Okay. I was going to say.
That's what
I still remember it was at one Endicott. I think they're still doing it like a summer ethics little mini conference.
Right. And we did not go.
I went to that, and he had some time, and so we found a little room, and I bought. This is back when we just were buying, like, we didn't know how to do audio, so we just would like buy microphones off Amazon and be like, will this be the microphone? And so we had these little clip-on mics, and I gave Peter one.
The way I buy pants.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Will these be the pants?
Will these be the ones? And we talked about goals and goal setting and how, you know, folks were like you said, Shanna, trying their best, but really we're missing the mark. And so that's like 10 years ago almost. So I'm guessing now, you know, the introduction to your papers are probably all like, we've all done an amazing job in the past 10 years. It's great. Everything is so much better. How far am I off the track? Can you tell if I read the article or not from that summary?
Yeah, I think the problem is that not enough has changed in the last 10 years. And I think a lot of what's been published and even some of what we talk about in our papers is that, okay, outcomes are bad and they've been bad for decades. And okay, 10 years later, here's another paper. Yep, they're still bad. So I think it's just finding ways like, how can we improve it? So that was kind of somewhere in the midst of doing like the lit review and other things. Like I was kind of looking frantically, like, how has no one done anything yet to like, how can we improve this, or what can we kind of do to fix this? So, like, we know it's bad. Okay. And I'm not going to write another paper just about that. Like, what can we do to fix this? Basically, and it's just, obviously it's a huge problem to attack. And it's not like I could do it myself or anything like that. It's obviously a huge feat, but we wanted to kind of start by looking into like, what can we do, or how can we fix this? So the lit review, I don't remember the publication if it's in exact order, but the lit review was kind of before we did the actual research to see like, okay, what is out there that has been done? And there wasn't really anything. So like the lit review was kind of it was like a monster of a project, because it was turned out to be like a 2-part thing, because initially we couldn't find anything really. There wasn't much. There was like this one line of research where they did kind of like looking at outcomes and trying to improve goals, but it was kind of very like nuanced to what kind of one protocol, or I forget what it was called, but that they did.
Was that the compass model?
Yes.
Is
yes.
that what? Because we had actually done we'd cited some of that same research because we did an episode on consultation. But yeah,
Yeah.
like you said, it was like super specific. It was like, what if with a teacher and a parent we made some IEP goals?
Yeah. And
so,
it was like specific to certain areas, and like, so the second kind of part of it was like, okay, there's not much like, direct research on how we're changing outcomes or even changing people's behavior to write goals differently or better. So then we just looked at what assessments and curricula are out there, because what's being done now in our field predominantly is that we're doing kind of a teach to the test model where we're doing a lot of like assessments, and then all the goals we write are informed by those assessments. And then it's like a circular kind of thing, right? So then the assessments improve and we're like, oh, we're doing a good job. And that's kind of a good outcome measure for us to pat ourselves on the back. Like we're filling in boxes on the assessment grids. And, for some that could be a good, meaningful outcome of treatment, but kind of just thinking like, how can we do a little bit better? And we don't want to just, turn out tool users of like, you pass the test, you learn how to do these 5 assessments, and now you can program for anyone with a disability or with autism. So trying to think like, so we looked at all of those, what's available now and kind of what skills do they have in common. And again, it turned out to be like a monster of a project in terms of all the areas that we looked at within those tools. But
more tools than I would have thought. Like, a lot of acronyms, some of which I did not know myself. So it was nice to have someone like you and the team doing all that extra work, a little legwork for the rest of us. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Shanna, I want to take a step back real quick. So you talked about how things have changed, but they've just been so slow or haven't been targeted in the right way. What do you see as some of the common barriers for this process not going faster? I mean, it's not a surprise that so many of the autistic youth that folks were supporting, working with, all the clientele, were going to grow up.
Yeah.
So, we all know this. Children grow, right? In 10 years, most children are teenagers. All teenagers are adults. But why not a similar shift sort of in, well, we had these, whatever these programs were back then, but now we've got all these great ones because it's been 10 years because we saw this coming from a mile away and therefore planned for it. I mean, what's sort of behind that failing?
It's complex, but I think there's a couple parts of it that I think are contributing. One, I think is like from what I started to talk about in the beginning is I think there's a big lack of awareness, and like we call it programming with blinders on kind of. And like I think we're seeing the day to day, the month to month, like, one treatment period to the next, or like one grade level to the next. And I think it becomes a pass the buck kind of thing, whether it's in a school, like, oh, the next classroom next year, or they'll teach them that next year. And then like once they're in ending children's services, I think the misconception is, oh, they'll learn that in adult services. And it's just like a lack of awareness of like what adult services is, first of all, and just the lack of ability to have that, the resources, the funding, and the professionalization of the field in adult services just drastically different. So I think one is definitely a lack of awareness of what's to come and what's available. And I think the other is just, again, well-intentioned, but just thinking a little bit too short term and thinking like, oh, these goals are really important. What can we do to improve this and increase, fix the data on this and improve and meet these goals that we're setting, but not thinking just long-term enough. So I think it's a couple of, twofold or threefold, whatever, but I think there's a lot of reasons there.
It would be
potential.
Sorry. It's okay. Go ahead.
You go.
Darling. It would be interesting if people that worked in with the younger age students were required to do at least a little bit in adult services, right? To kind of see like how it's drastically different and like how things would change. I've never worked in adult services, but I know Diana has, and she has like a drastically different viewpoint than I have. And I learned a lot from her talking about when she was working in adult services and how that is different. So I think it would be really, and I know from my students that have done that change, it's been so helpful.
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot, how it would be great to learn from other fields of like doing rotations or like the medical fields or like other fields. I think SLPs have a similar kind of thing where they have to like do rotations and at least have exposure. Because exactly what you said, Jackie, I think even if like the minimum exposure I got early on was just like, at least had it in the back of my mind of like, oh, this is what adult services is. It's very different. I think we all kind of, without that exposure, you just assume like, why wouldn't it be that adult services is just as well staffed and all of that? I mean, even we have difficulty with that in children's services, but I think it's just not well known enough that it's so much worse in the adult world.
Mm. So Shanna, jumping back to the article where you sort of were looking at like, what is there? Like, what are these guideposts that are out there? Do you mind sharing kind of, I know it was a lot of different assessments. I know you looked at a lot of different factors related to how the assessments scored, skills, how they then gave you what skills should be worked on from that. How many of them just were like, here's a picture, go do what you want with that information. So do you mind just sort of doing a brief summary of kind of the major findings that you sort of laid out in your paper, however much you think the average person might find helpful?
Yeah, no, there's a lot in there. And some of it people might be like, that's way too much information, but we wanted to pick it all as much in there as what we found. Surprisingly, we didn't put everything in there that we did gather. So we tried to pull out what we thought was the most kind of helpful or at least interesting to think about. So we looked at, first we looked at like skills that are common across all of them. So the specific tools we looked at were ones that were basically targeting those adaptive behavior kind of skills. So I think in the start of the paper, if I remember, we talk about like adaptive behavior and what that is and how the research we do have says that, if kids and young adults have these adaptive behavior skills, that is one way that we know for sure in the research that they'll have a better outcome and better opportunities and access to more environments and all kinds of things when they're adults. So for me doing this research, I'm like, that's kind of like the aha moment. Like, how are we not talking about this more? Like, we know what skills they need that can help them in adulthood. Why are we not focusing on that like intensely from early on? Once we kind of know, there's a lot that goes into that, but I think we need to start thinking about that before they're 22 and like, okay, now adult services, now they have none of these adaptive skills. So we looked at tools that specifically are made for that. So at least see like, okay, within all the adaptive skills out there, what do they have in common? Are they looking at the same kind of skills? Is there agreement on that? So we looked at a couple of things. We looked at like what skills are common across all the assessments. And there were kind of a less than you would think, I think, with their similar goals of all the tools. They don't have a ton of agreement with that, but there was some agreement. So we looked at that. And then we looked at, again, a number of things, but one that we thought was kind of important was which skills in which domains were kind of prioritized across the tools. So we did say that like, we're assuming they prioritize it based on the sheer number of skills within those areas. So like cleaning the house, for example, if a tool had like hundreds of skills in that, in our mind, we're like, okay, they prioritize that. So we kind of looked at how that was, if there was agreement or disagreement on that. And there was it just was pretty variable across skills that were all kind of tools that were all meant to kind of target the same kind of thing. So yeah.
I'm so curious how you sort of mentioned looking at kind of the breadth of each of the skills to sort of help quantify a little more of how much does this curriculum or assessment tool or both in some cases, care about the skill or rank this skill as importance. But to some extent, it seemed like you must have had to do a little bit of a apples to oranges comparisons by looking at all of these different tools. I mean, did you have to set rules of sort of what you were looking for, or was it sort of more broad guidelines based on the overall focus of the paper?
Yeah, we did have definitions of like what the domain areas were to kind of help. And some of it was hard because like communication and social kind of overlap, and like cleaning care of the home and cleaning care of clothing can kind of interact. Like, where does laundry fall in? So we kind of we had to try to define that as best we could. And it's definitely not perfect. And it was all of the dividing of the skills was done like manually by us. So obviously there's going to be some not perfect things here. Yeah, it was, again, a lot of work for that aspect of it. But yeah, we tried to look at like the breadth in terms of across all these different domains, how much they had within each area. And then the depth was kind of like, okay, how many of these skills in each of these areas to kind of see again what they kind of prioritize. So like one tool seemed like they really prioritized like cleaning versus other tools really prioritized like self-care. So that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it was interesting, like the degree they agreed and the degree at which that they didn't agree. So
for listeners, definitely take a look through the paper, because it is like Shana's saying, it's a ton of different subtests and subcategories, but the groups that the assessments and the tools evaluated was the AFL. So it's I always forget what the AFL stands for. Functional living skills, assessment of functional living skills, I believe.
Yep.
The Eden Autism Assessment and Curriculum School Series, which I had not heard of. The Essential for Living or Learning. Yep. I can never remember the L, but that one we're aware of. We
I think it's learning.
Is it learning?
I don't know. No, it must be living. It's living.
You know what?
Living.
Let's email Dr. McGreevy and say EFLL. Just put them both in there.
It's not
it's living.
It's essential. It's not essentials.
Yeah, it's essential for living.
Yeah,
essential. Let's call it the EFLLL. It's essential for living, learning, and loving, man. Just, really, new edition. Anyway, the Functional Independent Skills Handbook. I had not heard of that one. The Syracuse Community Reference Curriculum Guide. I had heard of that one. I've never seen that one. And then the Functional Curriculum for Elementary and Secondary Students with Special Needs, which it's a more recent one. I had not heard of that one as well. And it was really strange to see how different these tools that are purporting to assess relevant skills for adolescents and adults, that they couldn't sort of agree on what that would look like. Did you have any of those crises of faith, Shane, as you're looking through these, of like, oh my goodness, here I am looking at this, and I thought everyone else had the answers and we just needed to capture it, and they don't. Oh no.
Yeah, I think that was definitely an interesting point of it. And and I think some of it, I believe we discussed in there too, is that some of them report like the audience is a little slightly different. So I think some of that could be to some degree relevant. We also pulled out, so of those ones you listed, some of them don't have skills listed. Some of them are more like a curriculum, like kind of more like what Peter and I's book is, not necessarily lists of skills to check off, but more so like how to do this and like what to focus on and kind of guidelines and like tools to use. So the ones that we really picked apart all of the skills included were just the ones that have like assessment components where they have lists of skills. But yeah, they were, again, like very different. We did also compare them to the critical skills that Peter and I talk about a lot. So those were developed by him and a colleague a while ago, and we talk about that a lot in the book. So we also did a check to like, okay, these are skills that we, biased, I guess, as the authors consider really critical. To what degree did these tools include those? So that was interesting too. And some of them included all of them, and some of them included, up to half of them. So that was, again, pretty variable in terms of how they agree, basically.
Mm-hmm. I know one of the points that you brought up in the paper, and it's sort of one of those I love hearing it, but I also wish it didn't have to be that way, really goes to the need for lots of tools, not necessarily having a tool. And I know that is a big theme in your research. It's not like, if only we could find the perfect assessment and curriculum, then people could blindly follow it and everything would be so much better. Specifically looking at some of these, some of them being not that old, yet still out of date. You had a good mention. There was one about like which clothes to choose based on, what message you were trying to send to a potential romantic partner as a potential skill in one of these assessments. That one was a little not great. With any other good WTF moments when you were doing this?
Some of them have like, a lot of it is to like very seemingly, upper middle class suburban kind of living. So like just thinking about how like, or like, a dishwasher, not everyone has a dishwasher, or like street crossings can be very different if you're in a rural community versus like New York City. So like thinking about things like that. And, there are things like peel a grapefruit, or like, what if they don't like the grapefruit? Like we want to we have a lot of kind of preachy stuff to say of just like what to do and what not to do. We just want it to be that people aren't using these kind of tools like, oh, well, they didn't master peel a grapefruit. We have to make sure that they get that. It's like, you would think that's probably not going to happen. Or like, there's like power tools and like heavy machinery in some of these tools. So like thinking about, okay, if you have all of these tools, like it shouldn't need to be said, but it does need to be said, like, okay, pick from each of these tools. None of them are inherently bad necessarily, but I think they can all be good to get ideas potentially. But I think when you give any list of skills, no matter what skills list they come from or who developed it, I think we just want to really, the big point we want to drive home is to just have like that clinical judgment and that thought process that you're having of like, okay, well, this tool has these skills, but like he doesn't really need that because of his specific situation to make it specifically meaningful for his life, to improve his quality of life. Okay, this person doesn't need to like learn how to use a power tool, but they need to do this. So and that's like an extreme example, but just thinking of it more in depth of that, like, and just kind of the freedom to think basically to, you don't need to go based on an assessment tool or a curricula, but really think about, okay, what I have this as a tool, but it's not, we call it like guide, but not a roadmap to programming. Like anything could be a good guide, but we have to have someone who's like driving the car and like thinking of like, okay, but let's go this way, but he needs this. So that's kind of the main point that we wanted to make with like looking at all these tools. So just like, we just don't want anyone to pick up any tool blindly and be like, okay, we're teaching to this test is kind of the main point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? So one could take the items on an assessment and then interpret them for the individual that you're working with. So
yeah, exactly.
Just because it's on the list doesn't mean that it's going to be functional, meaningful, appropriate for that person. And that could be related to, their specific interests. It also could have to do with their culture and what's important there.
Yeah.
And keeping in mind, some of these tests are older, like you said. A lot of them are very Eurocentric in terms of what they're, placing importance on in the list. And I don't even like grapefruit.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's all be honest. I think it's overrated. It's overrated as a citrus.
Well, it makes my tongue feel fuzzy, and I think that might be bad. So.
I am allergic to grapefruit.
Yeah.
So we're AB Inside Track is anti-grapefruit on this podcast. We will. Ethically, if a client says, I love grapefruit, I'd like to know how to peel it, we're not going to say, well, forget it. We're not the BCBAs for you then. We'll help you with that one.
Well,
we might recommend, Jackie cannot. She will refer you to a non-allergic BCBA.
I actually found out I was allergic to grapefruit at work.
Oh, no.
I ate a grapefruit at work and I was like, oh, I feel weird. And my whole body just started exploding.
Gosh.
And everyone that I was working with was like, something's wrong with you. Like, you're very puffy. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I looked and I was like, ah. Yeah.
Way to find out.
Hi, do you want to be a BCBA? Also known as a board-certified behavior analyst?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts to get your graduate degree, just minutes outside of Boston.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education, dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years.
And our 2022 graduates had a 92% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy approved fieldwork placements, ethics mini handbooks, PhD levels professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland if interested.
And don't forget, our program is accredited by the Association of Behavior Analysis International, or ABAI, as a Tier 1 master's degree program.
Don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu.
regiscollege.edu.
One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there.
Bye.
Hey everybody, sorry to pause the episode, but I want to remind all our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. By listening to this episode, you're able to earn one ETHICS CEU. And to do that, you need to finish listening to the episode and then click on the link in your podcast player or go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to put in some key information, including 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first one now. It's boiler, BOILER, boiler. You probably have one in your home or apartment building, right? It's the thing that heats up your water so that you can have a hot shower or hot water from the sink. A boiler.
Love a hot shower.
It's good stuff. Boiler. All right. Back to the ethics of meaningful goals with Dr. Bahry. So, Shanna, I know you kind of mentioned the timeline of events, but so, I know, I can't remember if it was from this work, during this work, sort of all one. I don't know if it was one after the other. I know we love a nice, neat narrative when we can get it in life, but you've sort of gone on and been developing with Dr. Gerhardt sort of goal writing tools and other guidelines for goal writing. Was that in reflection of this process, or you sort of were doing it at the same time?
Yeah, I have to look again which the order it got published in terms of like the turnaround time for all of that. But we did the lit review first, and that kind of informed like, okay, there's nothing, quote unquote, that we could find out there that really does what we're looking to do. So that informed kind of the research we did first of developing a tool, a couple of the first tools that we created, and then wanting to actually get some type of data to support that it could improve to at least some degree in the way that we could measure the goal writing of clinicians and also students of behavior analysis. So that informed that to be like, okay, we don't think anyone has done much. Let's see what we can do to at least, begin to look at such a complex topic again. There's so many factors that go into it of like, we're trying to change the behavior kind of like how a clinician is thinking basically as they're creating a goal. So it's definitely like a complex kind of thing that we tried to make objective and, qualitatively looking at goal writing and how we can basically impact their thought process. And so we had a bunch of stuff as part of like a treatment package to look at that. So that kind of definitely led into the research that we started with.
Sure. Now, kind of taking the big broad view as you were starting this process, reflecting on this process, what existed, what didn't exist. And I mean, it's in the title of the article, the ethics of actually helping people. I mean, when we talk about the ethics of helping people, I mean, I think we kind of hinted at the idea of, the ethics of understanding our own biases against or pro grapefruit kind of examples. But, bigger picture, like what are you talking about when you're saying the ethics of actually helping?
Yeah, so that was a fun title. That was like me being snarky at. So B.F. Skinner wrote a book chapter, The Ethics of Helping People.
Yeah.
So he talks about like a specific example that always sticks out that I talk about a lot when I do talks is he talks about like a learner struggling to tie their shoes and how an adult is overlooking this and like starts getting jittery and stressed out and feeling bad, quote unquote, for him or her because they just, oh my gosh, he needs help. So they rush in, tie his shoes for him. And he talks about how in that moment he completely eliminated a practice and learning opportunity that they'll never get back. So he talks about one has most effectively helped others when one can stop helping them altogether. So that really stuck out to me. And I love that quote. And that's the first kind of line of the paper is basically like he said this, in the late mid 70s and looking at it now, fast forwarding to like the 2020s, how we're still not doing this enough. So I go into talking about how the BACB, if you look at the data that we have available in terms of like areas of professional emphasis for people in the field, it's like 3/4 of the field works with autism. So if you look at that piece of data and then you look at the fact that outcomes are poor and have been for decades, which like I said, there's been papers published on this for, again, decades. So we know that outcomes are bad. And now we know that 75% of our field works in this area. So what are we doing? How are we not doing better at this? And how are we not focusing on this more and talking about this more? And like we have research that says what skills are going to improve outcomes. Why are we not focusing on those skills? So that's kind of like the crux of that paper in terms of kind of like I wanted it to be like a call to action kind of thing. And we looked at the code and comparatively about like what the code has. And I know there's been talk in the field of like, okay, we're not just a field for autism. And so that's valid. But again, if 75% of us work with autism, I think there's something to say there about how can we make our ethics code really looking at this and how can we improve. We're not doing good enough, basically. So I kind of say in the paper too, or we say in the paper, we're not saying that we need a new code for autism or that we need to necessarily change the code. I think as it is now, I know it's a document that's going to keep improving and keep changing as the years go. But I think even as it stands now, we can pull out plenty of things that we can apply specifically to how we ethically need to improve outcomes. So it's kind of
I think one of the pieces that I know resonated with me looking at that article is the idea of, talking about beneficence. If we're just blindly helping people engage in tasks that we're saying to ourselves, they don't like this task. I don't think, are they ever going to use this task? That inherently feels like, and there you go, you're engaging in potentially unethical behavior, even though maybe you're doing what your job told you to do or a stakeholder told you to do. And the client's maybe not against the idea of the goal you're working on or mad at you or enjoys being in your presence, but just the whole thing feels like just the umbrella work is kind of unethical. I mean, maybe I feel bad just calling it unethical because I think that might be pushing it a little far, but maybe for shock value, we could call it that.
Yeah.
It's getting close, right?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about the different code items and how it can be applied to these different, guidelines to programming that I think we can pull out. But even I think is what you're getting at is even just the core principles, like the 4 core principles we added, just those alone, I think definitely support, okay, we need to make sure people have a quality of life that extends for their whole life, thinking beyond the childhood years is just, I think even just those alone are helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we take ourselves very seriously in our field, right? And so, it's not uncommon, I think, for people to take the code very seriously and say things like Rob is saying, well, if you don't do this, then it's unethical. But it's not the kind of field where you can just coast, because it's people's lives and it's their, like you're saying, it's their quality of life. It's what is going to matter to them in the long run has a lot to do with how we are instructing people to spend their time, right? So it is really serious what our job is. And it's not the kind of thing where you can be like, we'll just work on this because that's what we've always worked on, or that's my guess as to what's important. These are real important decisions that we have the honor and the responsibility, right, to help make happen. So it is, it all relates back to our ethics code.
Yeah. And it's something that's been talked about for decades. I think it's the Wolf 78 paper on social validity, where it says we're supposed to be dedicated to helping people better access their reinforcers. I mean, that alone too, again, in the 70s, why, if they don't want to do puzzles, why are we forcing them to do puzzles? What do they want to do that's going to be meaningful for their life and long term? And where can they go in the community? How can we get them out? Again, exposure to adult services, just knowing the limitations of where they can go, what they can do if they can't do some of these critical skills, like use the bathroom or learn in a group, they're not going to do much. They're going to be sitting. That's what adult services is, sitting and doing puzzles. And, not to discount the people who work with adults, they do great work and they're trying with what they can, but just the resources and the funding and the staffing, it's just, there are so many barriers to making adult services really, life enriching for all of the adults that need that support. So I just, one part of me will preach okay, improve the adult world. That's what we need to do. Pour all our resources and time into improving that and tell people work with adults. But the other part is okay, but if that doesn't happen and if it's not going to happen for a while, we need to spend all the childhood, early adolescent years getting them as ready as they can be. They don't need to potentially, learn how to read and do reading comprehension and, match and do different kinds of math. But, we can't send them to adult services not being able to use the bathroom themselves or shower themselves and, access the community and doing all of these really critical skills that are going to matter and be used in adult life. So I think that's kind of the, again, preachy moment there.
Yeah. And we put, lots of kids through these paces, right? All of our educational system, it could be argued that we are teaching pretty non-functional skills, but we have less influence in those arenas. I think in these arenas, we have more and we can be pushing for, why are we not teaching the skills people are going to need, right? Which the argument could be made whether your child in the education system has a disability or not, but we might not have influence across all those areas. Yeah. I feel like, just quickly, Wolf, obviously 78 is such a critical point. I also feel like Schwartz and Bear 91, where they revisit social validity, would fit in beautifully, right, with this argument. And then I know you're saying decades, and in my mind, decades, I'm still thinking the Gerhardt and Lanier 2011, which was such a call to action paper.
Yeah.
And the folks who were being referenced in that article, which was like a crisis on the horizon.
Yeah.
They're adults now. I know. And they're, probably 30 years old, the individuals who are like in those surveys. And I think about them. Like, I don't know them, but I'm like, what?
Yeah.
How are they doing? Because that crisis is on the shores, right? It's not on the horizon anymore in terms of providing services. And your papers are definitely like the follow-up to that, to say, we still have a lot of work to do.
Kind of why we didn't want to do another, like, okay, it's all bad, everyone. Like, I like that we could do another one of those, but it's like we could also look at the past ones and we're not improving much. So we were trying to really call to action again, but kind of giving more direction and more like tools for it, which is why like we kind of created the book. But like this ethics paper was, ethics is becoming not bigger, but it's becoming, as the years have gone by, now there's like more CEU requirements and more things. So definitely is emphasis, I would say, as our field grows, like any growing field probably, is that there's emphasis placed on ethics. So we wanted to kind of have a spin on that. It's like, okay, everyone's talking about ethics, but what about this part of it? So I think that's kind of one way we're hoping to call to action. Like, okay, well, the call to action paper is not that they're not working, but like we need to be louder and like, okay, how about we talk about how it's not ethical to keep doing it this way? So that was kind of one of the points of it too, is like that as a call to action, but specifically like, okay, let's look at the ethics code. It kind of says that we need to do this.
I love it.
Yeah. So Shanna, in terms of the goal writing tools that you piloted and then you published the paper looking at BCBA goals and reflection, and then students who received additional training in using the goal tools. The tools themselves, it was kind of focusing on, a couple different areas. They seemed like they were a little more, they were more about reflective and thinking about the client rather than prescriptive tools like we'd been talking about with some of the assessments might to do. And I'm guessing based on the papers that you've written, that was really meant to be more about thinking about rather than just telling people what to do and then potentially ending up in the same ethical problem area that we talked about. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, exactly. We didn't want to kind of have another list or like a checklist or like here's this tool, we'll hand it to you. Now you know how to do it. We definitely want it to be more like a critical thinking, like, okay, we want to shape your thought process and shape how you're actually going about writing goals and, thinking of them uniquely and not just pulling from a list. So yeah, that's definitely the point of and again, that's what made the research on it really difficult to qualitatively look at and who's deciding if a goal is good or not. So that definitely makes the research on it difficult, but we kind of approach it as like, well, that's probably why no one's really doing it. And because it is a hard topic, and we tried to approach it and just to at least have a start of like, okay, and even just, again, the very qualitative way that we did it, we did still have improvement. Again, it's subjectively objective, I guess you could say. So we rated the goals using one of the tools, and we had like expert raters. We had a couple different levels of raters. Some, I forget what we even called them actually, but some were like higher level PhD, been in the field for decades. And we had some who like had their focus in this kind of area, at least had to have a master's degree in this area. So we had different people kind of rating it. We did all kinds of stuff with the statistics of the rating so that it could be that we're kind of making it as clean as we could, basically, to look at something so qualitative and, subjective in a sense. So there was a lot to it, but we tried to, again, make a really complex thing as objective as we could to at least see, okay, here's one way to look at it. And we did improve them, quote unquote, at least in the way that we were looking at it. And I think it was a good start. Obviously, we need so much more in this area, but it was kind of a starting point.
Yeah, I liked in the limitations because you had the BCBAs who were using real goals and getting social validity assessment from the parents, and the parent social validity not changing that much from the original goals to the new goals, even though according to some of the expert raters, those were now better goals. The idea of it's not just clinicians who need to sort of be thinking about good goals. Lots of individuals and stakeholders to some extent might have been, for whatever reason, potentially gaslit as to this is a good goal because an expert once told me that's a goal that everyone should do. And like really retraining a lot of people as to well, what would be good? How is this important? There's almost like an advocacy piece, I thought, to that limitation of like
for
teaching
sure.
others that.
We also, for that specific result that we were like kind of disappointed in, we're like, what? How do you not see that that's better? It was definitely like a, clear, like, okay, we obviously really need to educate parents on this too. So that sparked a whole nother thing. Like I created a parent course on this after that of like, okay, we need to teach parents like why this goal is better and why your child needs to learn this, but not that, because there is a whole, that's a whole other can of worms of like parents who are, parents who always have the dream of like, no, I really want my kid to read, or no, my kid needs to learn math. And I think it's like a perspective shift that we need to teach parents to get ready for too. And like, why is this important? Well, he can do math, but you're still wiping him after a bowel movement. And he can do reading, but you're helping him shower. Okay, he's 11 now, but what about when he's 17? And, maybe you're a single mom. How comfortable will you be helping him with some of those skills in 5 years? So a lot of that that became kind of the next passion of like mine. Okay, we need to educate the parents and like educating clinicians, educating students of behavior analysis, all important, but kind of wanting to attack this in all different directions. Parents are and can be the best advocates for their child. So if we can, light a fire under them, I think that could be a whole other way that we could really help some of this problem.
Mm-hmm. And Shanna, I'd love to hear a little more about sort of that for the parents, because I feel like that what you learn in that process would also be helpful for talking to other stakeholders, like school administrators, town councils who are, writing the bills, and, the Department of Education kind of folks, right? Of getting them a little bit more, I don't want to say on board with adaptive skills, but reflective of where adaptive skills fit into the life of any given individual and fit into the quality of life discussion. How have you found that process to be in a way that couldn't inadvertently just turn into, okay, fine, you want a list, here's your Dr. Bahry list, and this is the 20 list, and someone will someday write a paper about how this list wasn't as good as the list it could have been, because there's so much we don't know about. We know adaptive skills do lead to better outcomes in some measures, but we know those measures are somewhat flawed, somewhat subjective. Yeah. So it's kind of, what are the pitfalls that you are really trying to think of so that you don't just inadvertently recreate another cycle of do this, and then we later say, well, why did we do that? What a waste of time that was.
Yeah. In terms of like what we should be educating parents and all these other stakeholders who are like the decision makers.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess it's more of that reflective work versus prescriptive work, but that's just kind of a thought.
Yeah, it is, and that's like, again, what I think is quote unquote scary for behavior analysts, to think of like these fuzzy concepts of like, oh, we need to like change how they think, and like a lot. I think we shy away from that too much because we're, afraid of not, conforming to like, the 7 dimensions and like, is it objective? Is it measurable? But I think we need to, if we're not doing it, then who is doing it? And like verbal behavior is still behavior. And like, still there's all kinds of research on that too, of like, we can still target some of these skills. So yeah, I think it is something we can and should do. And I do think some of it is that, again, tough to measure stuff, but I think we can if we really try. But a lot of it is, like you said, not necessarily prescriptive, like make sure they have these 5 skills. I think we could, in some sense, use the critical skills for that because they're like a finite kind of list. But they're also, again, we talk about in the critical skills, it's not like a checklist of skills. It's like a mini domain of skills. Like one is toileting, like that's like hundreds of skills within that. So it's not just in finding what is meaningful for this person right now for toileting. But sorry, to get back to the question, I think a lot of it to teach that what we want to teach the parents and like the stakeholders and like the lawmakers and all these people who have a big impact is a lot of what's kind of in the intro of probably all 3 of these papers is like just making it more accessible of like, okay, here's the research, here's all the ways that we're kind of failing people on the spectrum and with other disabilities. Here's what we know now of like, okay, if they have these adaptive skills, it's been shown that they'll be able to do more in their life as adults. And also here's the data on what adulthood looks like and how there's not much available and there's not much for them to do and like all these limitations. And then again, thinking about, okay, how can we plan for that? And for parents, some of the introspective stuff that I like to really include is like, okay, where do you see your child as an adult? And, where do you see yourself fitting into their life? And like some of like harder questions that can get emotional too, of like, what about when you're gone? Like, that's a big thing that we need to be thinking about. And it's really hard. But I mean, I'm here for it to be like the person to say it, of like, but because if not, it's like, it becomes a very big point of stressor once they start getting older. And like, that's a big problem of why adult services isn't what it is, because parents are getting tired and they're not advocating to the level that they are when their kid is 3 because they're 70. So there's so much there. But if they start thinking about it early, even if it's hard to hear and even if it's tough, like, tough love, like it's hard to hear, but it's like, obviously gently, you don't say it like, I'm not suggesting you say it in a terrible way, but
you're old,
dead
right? You're not
soon.
like,
So what's next? Yeah.
Yeah. And some of the questions in the Meaningful Goal Guide, which is one of the tools we use, are just those simple questions of getting parents to just start to think about that. And what we found in doing some of the research was like parents really just that's never been brought up to them. They've never thought about it before. And, a lot of parents are like, yeah, I think about it, but it's like in the back of my mind, it's scary. I don't like to think about it or talk about it. But some of them are like, trying to get through the day, the week, the month. So it makes sense. They're not thinking long-term. So I think as clinicians, that's why I want to teach us, like, okay, we need to be kind of pushing those conversations and asking as early as we can, like, where do you see them? How can we get them there? Let's plan long-term and set short-term goals to get there. So kind of a long-winded answer, but that's kind of, there's so much to it, I think.
Oh, I can imagine. So Shanna, can I want to do kind of a quick example of how we could put all of this together a little bit for clinicians who are sort of like, oh, but there's so many tools and my job makes me use, I don't know, the VB map, or they make me use the EFL, right? I have to use a curriculum, or I have to use an assessment of some kind, or insurance is making me pay for, is only giving me money if I use one of these. I don't think that was as big a barrier as there was some fear it would be. You've also got the meaningful goal guideline that you could be using with. You're also working with the stakeholders. But at the end of the day, you have to pick the right skills. And you mentioned this, and I love this in the papers, the right skills with the right procedures in the right context, right? That's what adaptive skills boils down to.
Yeah.
You need those the 3 R's. And I've never heard that phrase before. It's brand new. You made it in the paper, 3 R's. How would you recommend we go about doing that? Because I mean, you even make recommendations in the paper too of, to some extent, it might be better to teach clinicians to make critical judgments about goal development rather than learning how to use assessments really well, which scared me a little bit because I feel like I probably learned to do the assessments better than the critical goals in terms of my training. And I think I've gotten good at doing it all together as like a package. But, what could that kind of look like? You put it all together, like using the tools, not jumping ahead and saying, well, grapefruit's on there, I got to do grapefruit. How would you recommend we just go about that process? Like, what are the tools? Like, yes, use this. No, don't do that. Like, do's and don'ts.
And I think, like, again, it's not something I think you can necessarily prescribe, which definitely makes it hard to teach like clinicians and students of behavior analysis. Like, how do you do this? Well, I don't know. It's different for every kid or young adult, but obviously it is. I think like until we can change the insurance or special education world to really understand that, not that assessments aren't needed, but just like that they're not the end all be all kind of. So I think until that point where we can just, it's tough too, because you don't want it to be a free for all either. Like, okay, maybe if any of us in the room now, like just created goals out of thin air of what we're seeing, they could be great, but we don't want that. We'd want some guidelines too. So I think like that's kind of where we stand with like the guides, but not roadmaps to programming, like thinking of it as like it's a guide. It can help get us in the right direction. And it can be good for, funders to see that there is some objective, quote unquote, improvement. But I think until there's change or something with that, I think you could use some type of tool, but then I think just think critically about the results and then also think about what did you learn from the client and from the family, and like, okay, they can't do these 5 skills on this tool, but like, that doesn't mean we're teaching those. We're going to teach what the parent said is most important and what, the learner told me he wants to do. Like, so I think just learning to kind of balance the both of them. And that's kind of what our meaningful goal guide is meant to do, is like be a conversation with the parent, or if the learner is able to, respond to the questions, them as well. But kind of thinking again, really specifically, like that tool has questions like, what does their morning routine look like? What's difficult? Or like, where do you go in the community? What barriers make you not able to go to certain places? And like trying to like pick out goals. So it's kind of like a fact-finding mission is what we kind of think of it as with like the meaningful goal guide is like in the interview process, like you're not just asking questions to do a checklist and like, fill out the form, submit it to insurance. You're actually searching for goals, like based on what the parent says. Oh, that's hard for you. What about it? Like, what does he do? What does it look like? And kind of like, okay, that's a goal. That's something we should work on. That would improve their life drastically if we could fix that tomorrow. So we have one question on there is like, what skills would make you and your family's life better? So just thinking of it that way, like, yeah, we should maybe use assessments if we need to and if they're helpful, but also like we need to have it be a personal, unique, meaningful thing. Like this family, this child or young adult right now, this would fix their life in some ways. And that's kind of why we all do what we do is to improve people's lives. So I think thinking of it that way is just kind of the best way I would approach writing goals.
And Shanna, would you say when we talk about sort of, the ethics of our competence in some of these skills that what do you think would be missing then? Because like I could have learned and I got trained in, I don't know, the ABLES, whatever. I was supervised. I've used the ABLES. I understand verbal behavior and how it relates to the ABLES, right? So I could be competent in that area. But what piece of competence in terms of training or supervision would you say is missing when I then make the goals? Because I could see a lot of people saying, well, I learned how to use this. I know how to write goals based on these assessments. That's the job. And especially if I work with non-adult clients, why should I have to be thinking about 10 years from now? That's not my job. I mean, would you say that those people are maybe, I think you mentioned blinders as a potential area. I mean, would you say that they are willingly blindering themselves to making these like meaningful goals, or they're not thinking about it in terms of their levels of competence and should be? I mean, and if so, what could they do to sort of like get in the right mindset if they're not seeing this every day?
Yeah. One kind of thing I like to tell everyone, like sometimes when like we do talks and stuff, and I don't know who the audience necessarily is, I think one thing I always say is like, no matter who you work with, if you work with a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, if you work with just children, like every single person you interact with is a future adult. So I think looking at them with that lens of like, yeah, they're cute and they're 5 now, but in 5 years they'll be 10, and then 5 more years they'll be 15. Yep. So I think thinking of it not so short term. And so I think there's no, I work with kids, like, no, you work with a future adult. So you can do what is right for them at that age, but also thinking of like, they're going to be, an adolescent soon, and thinking of it kind of with that mindset is everyone has to be thinking long term, and kids become adults,
I was smiling during that because I always call myself a future adult.
Okay, how long can you use that phrase?
Yeah, tomorrow I'll be an adult, not today.
Yeah,
tomorrow I'll be the future adult that I've always wanted to be. But
that's like a future Jackie problem.
I do tell myself that a lot, so I thought that was That's why I had a little smile because
I think competence is tough, and it's hard to like, I think, define and know when you're competent at something, and that's something we probably still need to define a little bit better. But I think part of some of what we're trying to talk about in the ethics paper is like, if this is the field, if this is the area of the field you work with, if you work with autism, I do think part of our competence should be knowing like what the lifespan is and where adults where adults with autism are and what that looks like, and understanding at least to some degree what the lifespan will be and how we can teach. We always say begin with the end in mind, is like we need to be thinking about this. So I think it's everyone's responsibility no matter what age group you work with, because the kid that I get who's 17, I'm looking at like, oh, who are all his clinicians for ages 1 through 17? Like, why didn't you teach him that? Peter always says that. Why did nobody teach you that? So I think that's, again, important, thinking maybe he doesn't need the skill right now, but it takes kids with autism a lot longer to learn some skills. So you might need to be doing the skill since he starts 5. Maybe he needs to start at 5 because he'll master when he's 10. So I think it's, competence is a tough one, but I think we all have some responsibility to at least have some competence in where they're going after we're going to have some responsibility over their programming.
Well, that sounds like a good segue into the next segment of our show, the dissemination station. Where we do some final thoughts and summarizing. I had a final thought, Shanna. We're talking about kind of competence a minute ago. Wouldn't it be great if you as you're getting to know your client, you said, take me on a tour, like maybe to their stakeholder, like take me out to like where are you going to be hanging out for the next day, and then add that to your list of all the other skills and all the other assessments. Be like, oh well, we, like you mentioned, if we're in an urban environment, we crossed 50 streets, so check, that one goes to the top of the list, even though maybe the school you're going to is in a suburban area or something, or a big field, there's no streets to go. Well, we got to make sure we add that context. I don't know, field school.
I love the big field school. That's very close to a city. I love that.
But, really get a sense of what that context is. Or I mean, I guess you could probably say, how did you do your weekend? I think it'd be more fun to do the field trip and really live it out and go through the day and like, what do you need to know? But that's kind of what I'm thinking. So I'd love to sort of hear, in terms of, 10 years from now, you and Peter are going to sit down and write another follow-up. What will have changed so that it's not another call to action, that you're actually writing like, congratulations, mission accomplished, behavior analysis. Like, what do you think some of the big steps might have been? I know it's a little bit of a prescriptive. Like, what are the things people will have done or be thinking about that will result in a better 10 years from now summary paper?
I'm not sure. I think I would love to see more work and more research done in this area. That's always, again, kind of the ending of a lot of kind of papers like this, probably our papers too, of just like, we need more research. But I would love to see there be more of these big, large scale studies, like with children, the Lobos paper and similar papers of like longitudinal stuff where we looked at like, okay, where they end up. We do have some of that in this area, but some of that kind of stuff gets the stakeholders who have all the financial resources to help some of this stuff. Some of that is needed in those areas. So some of those higher level stakeholders will say, well, we need more research, we need longitudinal studies, we need this. So I think that would be good if we had more funding for that kind of research. And yeah, I mean, I think doing some of the stuff we're kind of really asking people to do could be really helpful if people are more aware of the need for adaptive skills. And if it gets more widespread in schools and minimally with behavior analysts, I hope that, insurance world has less pushback. That's the kind of another area we talk about a lot in one or several of the papers of, we need that understanding of these skills are important and here's why. I think not having to explain that would be a big growth area of like not having to have these same, talks that Peter and I do a lot of like bringing awareness. It'd be great if at least the awareness was covered so that at least we know, because I think that's the biggest thing too, of like what adulthood is, what would make it better. And even if people just knew that, and then even if the programming is not perfect, but if at least they knew, what's coming, how we can generally help people get there, and then fine tune kind of the processes after that. But I think that's the minimum that I would love to see.
I would love to see the rotation concept. That students, right, like SLPs and OTs have to go through rotations for like EI, severe units, right? Like residential, public schools, adult services, right? Like if you're like, yep, I'm going to work in this field. I'm going to work with people with autism and developmental disabilities. Now I'm going to sample all of the different places I could work. I love that.
Because maybe it would get people to be like, oh, I want to work with adults. That would be great.
I never knew. Yeah. Like, wow, this is much better. I'm not getting pooped on in the same way, right?
Yeah. I really advocate for everyone working with adults when I get a chance to, because I think it changes your perspective entirely in terms of what is going to be needed as a skill and what your focus should be when you're working with younger kids. So I'm a huge fan of that idea.
Yeah. Of like, I want them to avoid this kind of placement. What can we do to get kids not have to end up there? Again, nothing against people who are doing that. They're trying their best. They're doing what they can with the funding, but it's usually not going to be ideal. So how can we do better?
But it starts in childhood. It starts in early intervention, right? Teaching the types of skills that are going to be most beneficial to people. You can't wait on it. I know, as Peter also says, right? Like,
I've been saying that for probably a couple decades now. Adulthood begins in preschool, but we need to keep saying it until everybody understands like the relevance of it.
Yeah. to me, I think that, well, let me say my favorite Flannery O'Connor short story is everything that rises must converge. And I feel like that phrase is important here or helpful here. So all of these different conversations that we're having right now, like, come together, and I'm really hopeful for our field and that people are like ready, I think, to have these conversations. And not that we didn't want to have them before, just we didn't have access necessarily to people speaking on the importance of things such as what you're talking about, right? So the more that we are pulling in conversations from other fields into our own about self-autonomy and choice and assent and self-determination and the writing of meaningful goals and quality of life and person-centered planning, like all of these different conversations that we're having are becoming woven into what it means to be a behavior analyst in a way that people can, I think, articulate and act upon more easily than perhaps was previous, right? So my hope for 10 years from now is that we're all always talking about this because it's absolutely integral to what it is that we do. And we're laying the groundwork for that now. I really strongly believe that. And I think things are going to be moving in the right direction continually. And hopefully we're going to see that in a decade.
Yeah, for sure. I think we shouldn't be talking about autism without talking about like where they end up and where the whole lifespan needs to be talked about. There.
Well, Dr. Shanna Bahry, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thank you for talking about this such an important topic and continuing to write on it and share. We really always appreciate the chance to talk about kind of the adult world and how we can improve outcomes for individuals across the lifespan. If folks wanted to learn more about the kind of the meaningful goals checklist, the meaningful goals work that you and Dr. Gerhardt and I know others are doing, where would be the best place to find more information there?
So we have our book, Make It Meaningful. We have a website for that. I can send you the link or if you link it somewhere, but just makeitmeaningful.info. So that is a good place to start. And we have, information about the book there. And so that's kind of a good place to start. We compiled basically all the tools and a bunch more and talking about all the different topics that we think are really relevant for that there. So that's kind of a good place to start. I think there's a lot of tools that could be used from all types of practitioners and parents could find some use in it too. So I think that's kind of a good place to start. And we cite everything else in there as well. So one place to start.
Excellent. So we'll definitely have a link for that in our show notes for folks to go check that out and explore more.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you very much. It's great having you.
Yeah, thank you.
Once more, we want to say a big thank you to Dr. Shanna Bahry for coming on the show and talking about this very, very important topic. It's one that we have sprinkled in episodes around meaningful goals and preparations for adulthood since almost the beginning, like we said during the show, since almost the beginning. So we're always happy that this is a topic that we can come back to. And we're always happy to hear from listeners who are either in this field, thinking of entering this specific component of our field, or who are just more aware of what they need to be thinking of if they're working with other individuals, younger individuals, of what's coming later on and their role in preparing individuals for the majority of their life. So thank you very much, Dr. Bahry. Before we wrap up, though, we've got one more segment of the show, pairings. Diana, take it away.
All right. Yay. It's time for pairings. Pairings is the part of the show where I tell you about past episodes that you might want to check out if you thought this one was interesting. Good news, we've talked about adults and adulthood several different times on this show and or some other topics that were relevant, I felt, as well. So here you go. You could go back and check out episodes 13 and 14, way in the Wayback Machine, where we talked about transitioning to adulthood with Dr. Peter Gerhardt. Episode 165, Quality of Life. Episode 193, Essential for Living with Dr. Pat McGreevy. Episode 251, Self-Determination in IEP Planning. Episode 236, Assent and Self-Determination with Dr. Haley Steinhauser and Alex Kishbaugh. Episode 201, Advancements for Treatment with Autistic Adults with Dr. Sungwoo Kong and Dr. Chris Menente. Episode 265, Foundations for Working with Adults with Significant Behavioral Challenges with Dr. John Guercio. Lots of choices out there, which I'm glad, and I'm very excited to add this one to that roster. The other part of pairings is that I make a recommendation on a snack that you could enjoy while listening to these episodes. And the snack for today is the edible arrangement that we have in our fridge.
Oh, we should eat that.
Yeah, I know. I'm about to go do that now.
Oh,
it was when we were recording this, it was around my birthday time. And so Rob got me an edible arrangement, and it was so pretty.
Well, I felt bad because all of your other birthday presents were Christmas presents you bought for yourself and then forgot to take out of the basement. So it seemed I should get something extra. They were all great presents.
It all worked out great for me.
You know what? Pro tip,
I have great taste.
Buy yourself a present before your birthday, 2 or 3 months before, and hide it somewhere. It's a new present.
All right. And that's pairings. Please enjoy.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening to ABA Inside Track. Thanks again to Dr. Bahry for coming on the show. We want to remind our listeners of the last secret code word they will need. It is backpack, BACKPACK. That was a hard one to spell for some reason. It's the item you put on your back to store things, and you can carry them more easily that way.
Do you know what it's called in French?
Sac à dos?
A sac à dos. La sac à dos.
Oh, nailed it.
I just love that one.
Do not put sac à dos. I mean, you could put that if you want.
You can, and I will chuckle, but it's really backpack.
It should be backpack. Sorry to our Quebecian and French listeners out there, and other places where French is spoken. So, backpack. All right. Well, thank you so much again for listening to the show. Please, if you have not, please subscribe to ABA Inside Track on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can find us online on all the socials. You can find us at our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find links to all of the articles we discussed on this and all previous episodes. You can also find us on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe for as little as $5 a month. That gets you access to our listener choice quarterly episode videos, as well as free CEs for those, and access to all of our polls. If you subscribe at the $10 and up level, though, that's where the savings really kick in, and you're able to get our quarterly book clubs as soon as they are released, as well as the 2 CEs that go with those episodes. And at this release time, we've only got about a month or two before we're going to be putting out the big 2025-2026 book club poll. So if you are not subscribed on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, you're not going to get to pick the books. I'm so very sorry. You're just going to have to listen to our awesome discussions after the fact. Oh, well. Again, so that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. A couple more folks we would be remiss if we did not thank them. Thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for an amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!
Bye.